Yeah. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'll just make I'll introduce the program and make a few announcements before we begin. My name is Michael Claiborne from AMCHAM Korea. Thank you all for joining. We are joined today by two distinguished guests, Nelson Cunningham, President and co-founder of McLarty Associates, and Ambassador Rick Burt, Managing Partner and Eurasia Director of McLarty Associates. Today's discussion will be moderated by James Kim, Chairman and CEO of AMCHAM Korea. For those of you who are new to using Zoom, please note that only the panelists are visible and the audience's cameras and microphones are turned off by default. You are encouraged to use the gallery view so that all three members of the panel will be visible during the discussion. Our program will begin with a few opening remarks from the panelists, followed by moderated Q&A. We hope for active participation from the audience, so please do ask questions. You can ask questions by pressing the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and typing the questions. Alternatively, you can also use the chat function. That said, I would now like to turn it over to AMCHAM Chairman and CEO James Kim, who will begin our program. Thank you.
Great. Hey, good morning, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this webinar today. I love this title, the U.S. Election 2020 Preview, a Bipartisan Perspective. As most of you know, AMCHAM first debuted this webinar series in response to social distancing as it relates to the pandemic. And one of the greatest advantages of this webinar format is that we have the opportunities to host experts who may not be available because they're out of the country or not available in a live setting. So this is just a fantastic opportunity to really engage with our members and just learn from all the different speakers that we have available today. And today, I am so honored that we have two veteran insiders of U.S. politics from both sides of the political divide. First and foremost is Mr. Nelson Cunningham. He is the president and co-founder of McLarty Associates. He has worked closely with President Clinton and President Obama administrations and has a 2-decade history of working relationship with the current Democratic presidential nominee, Vice President Joe Biden. Our next guest is Ambassador Rick Burt. He is a managing partner and Eurasia Director of McLarty Associates. In fact, he's worked under Presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. He was also an advisor to John McCain and the Donald Trump campaigns. Obviously, these two gentlemen have immense knowledge about the current political scene. You should know that McLarty is one of the premier international strategic strategy advisory firms in Washington, D.C., and home to many of the world's leading experts on global affairs. In fact, our good friend, former president of AMCHAM, Tammy Overby, is a senior director of McLarty, and she's been very helpful in helping us put this program together today. So Tammy, as always, thank you so much for your leadership and your fondness for Korea-U.S. relationship. In a year as eventful as 2020, I think that this year's presidential election is going to stand out to be one of the biggest stories, maybe in a decade. And it's very good to have two experts that can give us a true, unique insider's perspective on what's going on in the two campaigns. A few months back, I moderated a similar session at the World Knowledge Forum between David Urban and Bob Woodward. That time, I was actually seated in the middle of these two gentlemen, and I could break up the fistfights that could occur. But today, we're meeting in a virtual session, so I hope that I don't have to get in the way of these two gentlemen. So I'm sure we're going to have a lot to talk about today. So without further delay, I'd like to turn it over to Nelson Cunningham to say a few words. Then we can get the Q&A started, hopefully get a lot of questions from the audience, and have a real solid, insightful discussion. So Nelson, let me give you the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jim, and thank you to the AMCHAM for pulling this together. One of the regrets of the pandemic is that I don't get to travel any longer. I usually travel to Asia several times a year. This year I was going to take my daughter to Vietnam and Singapore, That trip has been canceled. I first had the chance to visit Korea 10 years ago or more with our colleague Tom Hubbard, who is former ambassador to Korea. Of course, you all know him, and started our Korea practice at McLarty. It was on one of those trips that I first met your former president, Tammy Overby, there in your AMCHAM offices, and was so impressed that years later I was able to find her and hire her ourselves to help us with our Korea work. And she's a great stalwart for what we do, trying to connect Asia and America together, and the great businesses in both countries that do that. I did come to Washington 25 years ago with Joe Biden. I was his general counsel on the Senate Judiciary Committee. I've been a member of his extended political family ever since. I joined his campaign about a year ago when it started. I was with him in Iowa in the cold snows. I was with him in New Hampshire. I was with him in South Carolina, and saw the losses in the first two states, and of course the sweeping victory in South Carolina. And within 2 weeks, with Super Tuesday in early March, essentially handed Joe Biden the nomination. And then the pandemic hit, and the lockdown came. And for the last 3 months, Joe Biden was home in Wilmington. For 2 months of that time, all we heard was, "Where's Joe Biden? He's in his basement. He's not coming out." Donald Trump was commanding the podium in the White House at his daily coronavirus briefings, and Joe Biden, by the way, it's allergy season in Washington. I promise you this is not a COVID cough, it's just an allergy cough. And the popular wisdom had it that Joe Biden was hiding. I know for a fact he wasn't hiding. He and the campaign were trying to understand, how do we work in a digital world? No rallies, no public campaigns, no working the rope line, no putting his hands on people's shoulder and looking them in the eye, no kissing babies. How is it going to work? And I must say, I think there was some time when the campaign might have struggled with that. But in the last 3 weeks, I think this moment of a pandemic, the economic crisis caused by it, the careful social management required, and then the terrible death of George Floyd 3 weeks ago, and the reckoning that has really caused all across America, and this dramatic swings in public opinion we've seen, I think have dramatically reshaped this race and have given Joe Biden the reason he needed to leave his home in Wilmington. He's been out repeatedly in the last 3 weeks. He's been in Wilmington, he's been in Philadelphia. He traveled last week to Houston to meet with George Floyd's family and to give a taped address to the funeral service. This moment, I've known Joe Biden a long time. He came to politics because of civil rights. He came to politics because of the struggles in the 60s and 70s. And when I worked for him, we always knew that the civil rights communities, when they came in to see him, got top billing. You know who got second billing, but also at the top? The police and law enforcement. Joe Biden knows both of these communities deeply. And when it comes to being able to address both sides of this debate in the United States, the civil rights side, the African American groups, the groups that feel left out and aggrieved, and the police who are trying in this role, how do we find new ways to keep Americans safe while also keeping potential victims safe? How do we balance that? And this is an essential conversation that we're having. The American public is extraordinarily focused on it. And Joe Biden has really found his element on this. He's found his voice. coming out of his basement in Wilmington. He's found his voice. He's speaking eloquently on these issues. And the polls we've seen have shown a remarkable change in the last 3 weeks. There was a time in March and April when Donald Trump was only 5 points behind. He was only 5 points underwater, meaning his unfavorables were only 5 points more than his favorables. Still a bad position to be in, but better than his usual 10%. They've now climbed to 15%, which is extraordinary. 15% more Americans disfavor Donald Trump than support him. The polls that are coming out now on the Trump versus Biden race have Biden's lead expanding. By the way, at this time 4 years ago, Hillary Clinton was 1.8% ahead of Donald Trump. That's roughly where she ended. Today, Joe Biden is anywhere between 5 points and 14 points ahead of Donald Trump, depending on which poll you believe, and the average is somewhere around 7 or 8 points, far ahead of where Hillary Clinton was. Now, you all will say, well, yeah, come on, national polls don't mean anything. It's all state by state. And I agree. And so you look at the state polls. I don't know if our AMCHAM friends have the one slide that we sent forward. If you do, you might put it up on the screen. If not, I'll just go forward without it. Here we are. In 2016, Donald Trump won the election in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania by razor-thin margins. Out of more than 9 million votes cast, he won by 78,000. The question I get today is, well, who cares about the national polls? If he wins in those 3 states, the election is his. And that's right. But that vote is not baked in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And I know that because this chart shows you, compares the vote in 2016 with the vote 2 years later in 2018. And look at the change in those numbers. Look at the color change in the maps. Look at the change in the numbers. Democrats in the federal votes, in the federal elections in 2018, overwhelmed the Republican vote. And instead of being shy 78,000, they were ahead by 1.1 million. That's a 1.2 million vote swing. Thanks, you can take the slide down. So when you look at the election today, you ask, where is Joe Biden in the key battleground states? The numbers I've got here are a little out of date. They're actually better now than they were, but still, in each of the key 5 battleground states, Biden is ahead. 4 points in Florida, 8 points or more in Pennsylvania, 8 points or more in Michigan, 5 points in Wisconsin, and in Arizona, 4 points. Now, Arizona has voted for a Democrat for president in the last 70 years once. This is the home state of Barry Goldwater. It's the home state of John McCain. It has voted for a Democrat once in 70 years. That was Bill Clinton's reelection. And Joe Biden is ahead. And the Senate candidate, Mark Kelly, a former astronaut, who's running against a sitting senator, is 12 points ahead. That's Arizona. So we're seeing, I'm going to end shortly, we're seeing a widening nationwide. I speak to the senators who are running in these states because I'm helping them and advising them as well. And they are seeing in the last 3 months, they've seen their leads widening dramatically. And that's because the overall political landscape has changed in their favor and in the Democrats' favor. So that's my view of the political landscape. I'll turn it over to my good friend and jousting partner, Rick Burt. We've been doing this since 2008 when we were able to actually travel the world. And we traveled to Europe, we traveled to India, and have done this in every election cycle since. He's a very good debater, and he's about to tell you why I'm wrong. Over to you, Ambassador.
Hey, Rick, I just want to preface by saying that was a powerful intro by Nelson. I hope you have a good comeback for Nelson.
Yeah, well, so do I. No, that was a very strong opening statement. And let me begin by saying that there was a lot that Nelson said that I agree with. Most importantly, I don't disagree with his overall point, which is, as I understood it, that if the election were today, Joe Biden would win. And I largely agree with that point. I don't disagree with the polls, both the national polls and the polls that Nelson referred to in terms of the important battleground states. That said, I want to emphasize a couple of crucial points. First of all, we are living through, as he pointed out at the beginning of his presentation, a truly unprecedented and highly volatile period. Things can change dramatically. I think that 5 months ago, Biden wasn't seen as formidable a candidate as he is today. And arguably, I think you could make the case that maybe right now is a high watermark for Joe Biden as a presidential contender. And I think to make that argument, I would underscore 4 critical points. The first is Donald Trump himself. I should, in all honesty, point out that I do not consider myself a strong Trump supporter. I am a Republican. I've been a Republican all through my career here in Washington. But I don't necessarily support Trump at this point. But I do recognize, number one, that he is a formidable contender. As a man who just turned 74, he has remarkable energy. He is relentless when it comes to campaigning. You can argue about his ability to govern, but you can't argue about his political skills. Number two, he is a fighter. He will fight all day, all night, and sometimes he'll fight below the belt. Number three, he's a great wedge driver. He understands identity politics, and he goes for the juggler. He knows how to build an argument that divides and conquers and gets people to support him. And perhaps most important, he is shameless in his politics. He'll claim credit when it's necessary. Whenever there's a success, he'll say it was because of him. And if there's a failure, it was somebody else's fault. And what is quite surprising in terms of my understanding and most people's understanding of American politics, this approach has largely paid off. That moves me to the second point I would want to make about Donald Trump, which is he has turned the Republican Party, which is a great old party, a party which was founded by Abraham Lincoln in the 19th century. He has turned the Republican Party into his plaything. In fact, I would go so far as to argue that the Republican Party today is less than a traditional political party and more of a kind of Donald Trump cult. He has a fanatical support from the base of the party. His party is largely moved under Donald Trump's tenure from an upper middle class party to a lower middle class and working class party. It has a base of support with evangelical Christians in the deep South, from people in the Midwest, people from the Rust Belt in the upper Midwest. And these people love Donald Trump, and they will walk the plank for this politician. And that's where I would go back to Nelson's arguments about the battleground states. And Nelson was correct to point out that in 2018, in the congressional cycle, that the Democrats beat the Republicans in the congressional elections. But in states, the battleground states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and others, in 2018, Donald Trump was not on the ballot. In 2020, he will be on the ballot. And while Donald Trump is, and Nelson is correct here, behind in most of the polls, if you dig deeper in those polls, you find that the intensity of Donald Trump's support amongst voters is stronger than Biden. And so more of them are likely to turn out and vote for him. So I think the polls are a little bit unhelpful in understanding how competitive Donald Trump is. And thirdly, as Nelson himself pointed out, our electoral system is based on states, not nationwide voting, and it's an electoral college. And that also favors Donald Trump because his base of support is in those smaller rural states that have outsized influence in the electoral college. Remember, in 2016, Hillary Clinton won by over 2 million votes, but she lost the electoral college. So even if Joe Biden gets more votes than Donald Trump in 2020, and that's, I think, very possible, the same thing that happened in 2020 that happened in 2016, and Donald Trump could win the electoral college vote. So as I look at this impending election in about 5 months from now, I look at 2 or 3 critical issues. One is, and Nelson has mentioned this, is the impact of the pandemic. I think the pandemic has dented Donald Trump's popularity. I think one of the reasons that Biden is leading in the polls is because of the perception that the United States has not managed the pandemic well, but that could change. Right now, trends are adverse to Trump. There are some spikes in the coronavirus in the Deep South and in the West. But progress, for example, on a vaccine, which seems to be taking place, could transform Trump's electoral chances, and it could give him a positive boost. The same is true in terms of the economy. Right now, he is behind the 8 ball because we have almost 40 million people unemployed. But there were recent job statistics showed that there was more growth in new employment than the economists thought might happen. And people are looking towards the third quarter as potentially a quarter of real growth, and that could also transform perceptions for Donald Trump. And looking at these social problems and the racial issues that are so much now of focus in American politics, again, there's a danger here. Trump is beginning to shift. Just today, he was prepared to begin to look at police tactics and behavior with the whole issue of policing in America. And if there is a perception that grows over time that the Democrats are prepared to live with more demonstrations and even violence in some of our cities, Donald Trump's law and order message, which so far hasn't been successful, could over time before the election begin to get traction, and that too could help him in this election. So it's way too early to judge. The jury is out both in terms of the impact of the pandemic as well as the American economy and the issue of racial justice in America. And I would make 2 final points here. One is there is still a question mark over Joe Biden. Washington, of course, knows Joe Biden, a long-time senator and vice president, but Americans as a whole have a short memory. And Joe Biden needs to do a better job, in my view, than he's done so far to define himself. And he is going to have to do that against relentless negative criticism by Trump and the Republican Party. The Republicans have only now begun to tear Joe Biden down. And finally, let me make a last point about foreign policy, which generally speaking will not be a huge issue in this election. but I am old enough to remember as a young kid watching the 1960 elections and the debates between Nixon and Kennedy for the presidency in 1960. And they debated the Soviet Union and who would do a better job coping with the Soviet challenge and the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. A very similar debate, in my view, is likely to come this time in 2020 between Joe Biden and Donald Trump over the United States and China. And the question of who's responsible for having giving the Chinese too big of a leeway in terms of their role in the world, and who can be stronger and firmer and tougher with China going into the future will be potentially a critical issue in this election.
You know, hey, gentlemen, I just want to say that with all the different AMCHAM meetings so far, especially via webinar, you two guys were really fantastic. I wish we could have done this in person, but just your two opening comments, I think resonated very nicely with the audience today. So Nelson, let me start off with you with a quick question. I think we all know that this period is probably the most uncertain we have experienced in probably decades. But with you being an analyst or a forecaster with the election, how does all this uncertainty impact how you do your job as an analyst or forecaster?
Well, that is what we in America call the $64,000 question, because the uncertainty is extraordinary.
Yes.
But where we were 3 weeks ago is not where we are today, and we don't know where we're going to be 3 weeks from now. Just an example, 3 weeks from now, if you'd said to me, who is Joe Biden going to pick for vice president? I would have said Amy Klobuchar, because she would help him in the key upper industrial states, upper Midwestern industrial states. She's from Minnesota. She herself is a centrist. Her politics would fit his very well. And they would be very compatible. Since the death of George Floyd and the turn toward racial justice issues, the fact that she, Amy Klobuchar, used to be a prosecutor in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, is suddenly a negative. People are criticizing her for that she wasn't hard enough where she should have been. She didn't protect individual rights as much as she should have. So she went from being the favorite to being far down the list. I can't tell you who's on top of the list, but I am telling you that what's happening day by day is changing things dramatically. And I'll end with this. And I know we'll get to foreign policy and China and trade, but here at home, when Joe Biden locked in the election in March, he in effect put an end to, we thought, the left versus center debate in the Democratic Party. Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders were gone. Joe Biden, the centrist, the broad, reached out to the broad party, had won. That was the direction. Well, the pandemic and now the social justice cries of the last 3 weeks have reshaped the race again. The left has a lot to say. And by the way, the center is listening to the left. Even the Republicans are listening to the left. Who would have thought that a Republican-dominated Senate would vote unanimously for $3 trillion of unfunded debt to get us out of a pandemic and out of a recession? So things are changing dramatically. Where we're going to be on this left versus center fight, I can't quite tell you. But this fight is not a fight that Donald Trump is going to benefit from, I think, in the end. I think it'll make the Democrats stronger. Although Rick Burt, as he has said, Trump is a vicious attacker. He is extraordinarily tactical. He knows how to divide. And if there is a way to take advantage of this debate in the Democratic Party, Trump will do it.
You know, Rick, I think Nelson articulated the uncertainty that we're really faced with today. But when you look at 2016 election, Yeah, there were some battles, but it was not as uncertain as we're faced with today. And I know that even Nelson talked about the polling in some of those battleground states. So as of today, how can we trust these polls in 2020? We have uncertainty. That's a lot more than 2016. 2016, we obviously had polls that really were not accurate from some of those battleground states. So what do you say about these polls? Should people out on the streets actually look at polls and even look at it from a reliable perspective?
Well, I'm going to quote my friend Nelson, because you've also asked a $64,000 question. Because
I'm sorry, guys.
No, the so-called Washington bubble loves the polling business, and as some of you may know, some of your members may know, there's a famous political website in the United States called Real Clear Politics, and you can go on that every day, and you get all the latest polling, and it's broken out not only nationwide but state by state, and you can follow these things. The problem is that really, I think, twofold. One, as I was indicating before, the top line of the polls, who is ahead, the so-called horse race, and by how many points, doesn't measure a lot of important variables, like the one I was pointing out before, is intensity. It may be that Joe Biden is ahead in all of these swing states, these battleground states, but if only 60 to 70% of his supporters go out to the polls and 80 to 90% of Trump's supporters go out to the polls, hey, that makes a big difference. That's point one. Point two is we don't even know with our pandemic, and this, let me sort of in parentheses say, I just wish that we had managed our problems with the coronavirus in the way that South Korea managed its issues. I'd be a lot happier. But it's very likely that come November, we're going to still have a very serious problem with the virus. And we're going to have to deal with the problems of people voting and mail-in voting. And the implications of that are very unclear. It's not just a problem that Trump doesn't like mail-in voting, and so there may be Republican states that raise obstacles to it. It's just not clear to people how this is going to affect the overall vote, and how that's going to skew either pro-Republican, pro-Democrat. So that is a huge uncertainty as well. And then finally, there, as I think I sort of indicated, there are a lot of things that have to evolve between now and the election. And one of the big ones, and I agree with Nelson, and he says that so far the Democrats have sort of done, I think they're in a better position, especially with the most recent set of issues concerning racial justice, than the Republicans. However, we don't, again, know how this is going to evolve. And if it looks to people over time as though the left, the radical left in the Democratic Party, are sort of seizing the initiative in terms of the Democratic Party as a whole, that's something that Donald Trump and the Republicans are going to jump on very quickly. So the problem that Joe Biden has is he's basically a moderate, but if he's sort of forced to move too far left to accommodate the leftists in the Democratic Party, that's going to open up a big space for Donald Trump.
I know that we have limited time today, so I want to get straight to one of the big elephants in the room. And Nelson, you kind of talked about that. In 2016, I think trade was a big conversation. I know we talked about NAFTA back in those days, cross FTA, and I think President Trump at that time used it, as his advantage in winning the election. Let's talk about China. You kind of mentioned how China may be the one big question mark that the debate could center on. Can you walk us through who or what this thing favors as far as the China-U.S. rift is concerned?
Jim, another great $64,000 question. They're piling up here. Joe Biden, when he becomes president, is going to change a great deal of American foreign policy. He's going to throw out Donald Trump's foreign policy, and he's going to bring us back in almost every part of the world, back to a world that we're used to. In fact, he traveled last year to the Munich Security Conference, Biden did, and the theme of his speech there was, America will be back. Just wait, we will be back. And I think the world looks and hungers for America to be back. I know that's true in Europe. I know it's true in Japan. I know it's true in South Korea, Southeast Asia, looking for a partner that's more stable and more normal, that fits the bipartisan consensus that American foreign policy toward its biggest allies has tended to follow for the last 30 years. The one place where Biden will not go back to where we were before is China. And that's because in Washington, the old bipartisan consensus on China has changed. Until about 5 or 6 years ago, for 30 years, you'd find Democrats and Republicans saying the way to deal with China is to engage. We're going to engage commercially, we're going to invest, we're going to bring them out into the world economy, we're going to get them into the world, the multilateral organizations, the WTO, the UN, we're going to engage them, APEC. Bob Zoellick, who is Rick Burt's good friend, a well-known Republican strategist and leader, came up with the phrase, responsible stakeholder. We wanted China to be a responsible stakeholder. And that would change China, we believed. About 5 years ago, that really began to change dramatically in Washington. I think as a reaction to President Xi and to Xi's nationalist, more militarist, more power-focused approach to China's rise. I heard a China expert today say that Xi is the first president since Mao, or the first leader since Mao, who did not make the economy the top issue in China. He makes dignity and China's power position in the world the top issue. So America has reacted to that, and there's a new bipartisan consensus in Washington, which is that China is a competitor, a strategic competitor, and perhaps an opponent, and one that must be dealt with firmly, and that we have to face them down. So Biden is not going to be Barack Obama or George W. Bush or Bill Clinton when it comes to China. He's going to sound a lot more like Donald Trump in some ways. Here's the big difference. He is not going to do it unilaterally. He instead is going to go first to the Koreans. He is going to go to the Japanese. He's going to go to the Southeast Asians. He'll go to India, and he'll go to the Europeans. How do we put together a multilateral approach to go and face China down and bring them to the table in a productive way? I don't think he'll drop the tariffs against China. He'll drop the tariffs almost everywhere else, on autos, on steel and aluminum, the threats that he's raised against Korea, Japan, the Europeans. But he'll keep the tariffs on China, I predict. That's my personal prediction. He hasn't said that, but because he'll want to bring China to the table, and tariffs are the way to do it. So I think Donald Trump and Joe Biden are going to sound a lot alike on the China problem, but their solution is going to be dramatically different. And I think that Joe Biden's solution is one that's going to work much better for Korea, for Northeast Asia, and for economic development.
So hey, Rick, is it helpful for Donald Trump's re-election to really escalate the China-U.S. rift?
Yeah, it absolutely is. It absolutely is in a couple of different ways. First of all, You know, I was referring earlier to our poor performance in dealing with the coronavirus. And as I was arguing, one of Trump's great skills is to be able to deflect blame. And China and the WHO are his two main blame objects. He can blame China for their failure to inform the United States early on, their lack of transparency, the fact that they didn't really become willing to talk about this problem until it was too late. And secondly, he can blame the WHO for not, again, warning the world in a timely fashion by being in league or somehow the puppets of the Chinese. That's number one. But number two, and it's just beginning now in Washington, the Trump team has got a political ad on the air which has Joe Biden and President Xi drinking champagne together, toasting each other, and then a statement that that Biden made, saying China. This is a quote: "China is not the problem." And then he has about 2 minutes of showing empty, rusting American factories, and that is just so critical to the Trump base of focusing and blaming Joe Biden and the Chinese for the deindustrialization of the United States. So that's what Trump is all about. And by the time that November rolls around, the Trump campaign will want to make Joe Biden responsible for all the failures of American uncompetitiveness over the last 15 years.
You know, let's now talk a little bit about U.S. Korea. There's a lot of dynamics going on. Obviously, there's a big discussion underway about the cost sharing, which has not been resolved yet. There's a lot of discussions, at least in the media, about potential military pullout or reduction of military here in South Korea. So from Washington, D.C. today, what is the view of Korea, especially the U.S.-Korea relationship? And if you were Koreans here, I'm talking about the Koreans here in South Korea, who are you really hoping for, who could be helpful for the Korea's best interest? And let's start with you, Nelson, and then Rick, I'd love your perspective as well.
Jim, the issue of America's posture in the world is clearly one that Donald Trump wants to make an issue in this election. And what he is doing, and by the way, Rick Burt is one of the great experts on American force projection in the world. He was U.S. ambassador to Germany at the time that Ronald Reagan said, "Tear down this wall." There's a picture with Rick Burt sitting just 4 seats over from Ronald Reagan when he gave the speech. He knows more about the role that American forces abroad have played in post-war stability than anybody. And I think he and I will both agree that what Trump wants to do is, by the time of the election, he is going to want to pull back United States forces. He's already announced it in Germany. And I think if I were in Korea and Japan, I'd be deeply concerned about American pullback there. He will want to take as many troops as he can out of our out of our allied structures by the time of the election. So it will be hard to reverse it. He deeply believes that it's terrible for the U.S. to be out there with our forces among our allies. He doesn't understand the stability that is brought to our relationships. All he sees is the burden that he thinks it places on America, the cost burden, the people burden, personnel burden. He doesn't understand the greater benefits that it has brought. So what happened in Germany last week with the announcement that we're going to pull out force. By the way, there's no plan to pull forces out. You ask the Army and the Air Force, they say, we have no idea. We've got no instructions. Nobody's told us what to do. All we know is some presidential tweet. The same is going to happen in Japan. The same is going to happen in South Korea. And it's going to greatly destabilize your country's sense, these countries' sense of their relationship with the United States. Is the U.S. a reliable ally? Are we not? Could we be there? Could we be counted on? Look at the issue right now, the set of issues between Japan and South Korea, which are so sharp and so difficult. Where is the United States in trying to help our two great allies sit down at the table and talk to each other? Instead, Trump is encouraging our two great allies to talk past each other. I can't imagine anything more destabilizing. By the way, listening to us is the man I've learned the most from. Tom Hubbard is in the audience, and I've learned more from listening to him about Korea and Japan than anybody else. He's a true sage, and I'm delighted to have him as somebody that we rely on in our firm.
And yourself, Rick, do you care to comment on this topic?
Yeah. I mean, this is where one of those places where I have to say this is where I'm more of a traditional Republican and less of a Trumper. I mean, the fact of the matter is that there are administrations that think for one reason or another, that it's a good idea that the United States reduce or eliminate its presence in Korea. Remember, way back in the 1970s, that was an issue with the new Carter administration. But look, our presence in Korea, we're not doing a favor for the South Koreans. Our presence in Korea, it not only serves U.S. interests, but more importantly, is part of a bigger mosaic, a structure for peace. A structure for peace that involves our collaboration with the Korean forces, our presence in Northeast Asia more generally, our security relationship with Japan, our presence in the Pacific, and finally our global presence together with our allies. We are all enormously successful because we've been able to promote peace and stability, not only in East Asia but globally. And part of this, an important part of this, is the security relationship between the United States and South Korea. So it isn't just a question of sending a signal to American voters that, let the Koreans take care of themselves. That is a very short-sighted view of American national security interests. And so I very much agree with my colleague Nelson, and I would hope, with regardless of who wins in November, that the people, and I think there is a majority of people in the Congress and in Washington who understand the strategic importance of the South Korean-American security relationship.
And for today's session so far, I don't think anyone mentioned the word North Korea. Yeah. North Korea was big news yesterday when they blew up the facility that promotes some cooperation amongst the two countries. And I really haven't heard a lot about North Korea recently in the U.S. media as well. How does North Korea get back into the presidential campaign, if any? Is that kind of a lost case now, old news for Americans?
Well, again, this is in my view, this is an example of if you were to ask President Trump this question, he would have to find someone to blame for his failure to consummate a relationship that would lead to the denuclearization, because that was, of course, the goal. And I think he believed this is pretty easy to do. All it takes is somebody to get in the room with Kim Jong-un and we'll get it done. But the fact of the matter is that this is a very hard problem. And it's not a problem that's going to be resolved simply by sitting down with Kim Jong-un. So I hope we haven't built up expectations that are going to lead now the North Koreans to make any foolhardy moves prior to our election. That would be seriously destabilizing.
What about you, Nelson? Any comments on North Korea contribution here?
Yeah, Trump's attitude toward North Korea and his really feckless approach is flying to Singapore, that summit, the second meeting, stepping across the line, holding hands with Kim. It all came to nothing because Donald Trump came to these negotiations thinking that his experience as a New York real estate developer gave him all the negotiating skills he needed. If he could bully somebody and then flatter somebody and throw some money at somebody and dazzle somebody with a little pizzazz, he could get his deals. He thought that's all you had to do deals around the world. And that's what he tried to do with Xi. He tried to do that with Modi. He tried to do that with Kim. And what he found is it doesn't work. You cannot razzle dazzle somebody from a poisonous regime like North Korea's and abruptly bring them around to the table. His policy toward North Korea has been one of the great failures of the last several years. We've gone from a place where under I think Democrats were more successful, but Republicans also tried to carefully negotiate regimes for reactor inspections, for nuclear limitation, for measured step downs in North Korean ability to manufacture nuclear weapons. That's all gone away. And instead, North Korea feels free to do anything it wants, including, as they did in the last 24 hours, blow up that building in some childish show that they're no longer interested in peace with South Korea. That's what Donald Trump's negotiating strategy has brought. It's going to take real repair on the part of Joe Biden and the next normal president to bring this all back to normal. It's going to take a lot of time and effort.
I know that we just have, a few minutes left. So I wanted to take one question from the audience because I think that even with this short time, we covered a lot of big topics, right? We covered the polling, the China situation, U.S.-Korea relationship, North Korea, and just all the uncertainty that we're faced with. But here's a kind of a clear question for both of you gentlemen. The question is from one of the audience members. Could choosing the right running mate be the biggest decision for Democrats? And how would Trump counter this in order to capture some of the minority voters? Easy question, right, for both of you?
Well, let me go ahead and start. And I touched on this before. When Joe Biden said at that debate in early March, when he was debating Bernie Sanders, he said, I'm going to pick a woman as vice president. Shocked everyone. He followed it immediately with another statement. And I will pick a woman of color to the Supreme Court. I think by that careful pairing of statements, he was saying, I'm going to pick women for both of these spots. But if I pick a white woman for vice president, don't be surprised. And don't think I've forgotten communities of color. So I'm going to give you a Supreme Court choice. I think that was carefully balanced. He had in his mind, I don't know who he had in his mind. Again, my guess would be somebody like I'm so sorry, allergies.
It's okay, no, please.
Allergies here are terrible. But I think that's changed. Just to wrap it up, I think in the last 3 weeks, that calculus has changed. It's a hugely important choice because it'll send a signal about the direction of his administration. And he's going to have to carefully balance the demands from the left, which are louder, more insistent, and frankly, more persuasive than they were 3 months ago. We have to move the country in a different direction on the economy and on race. And just saying, I'm going to get you back to normal is not where we need to go. We're going to need some bold leadership. So yes, the choice of vice president will make a huge difference. I know right now that there's a massive enterprise going on, vetting different candidates. They've got lawyers looking at their backgrounds. They're interviewing them. Biden is spending time with them. He was vice president. He knows what a good vice president is. He knows what an important difference he made to Barack Obama as his loyal and good vice president. And he wants that for himself. He also has to be conscious of the fact that he'll be 78 on election day. And if something happened to him, whoever he picks has got to be ready to fill his shoes on a moment's notice. Huge decision.
And Rick, lastly from you, right? It's obviously an important pick. Any guesses, and how would the Republicans, react to that?
Yeah, first of all, I agree with Nelson. This is not a typical vice presidential decision. Most people don't, when they go in and vote for a president, they don't cast their vote based on who the vice presidential candidate is. In this case, they might, because as Nelson pointed out, you're talking about a guy who will be 78 if he becomes president. That means he's probably only going to be a one-term president. And whoever he picks as vice president is going to be somebody who's got the lead on becoming the next president. And so if he does pick a woman, and he picks say an African American woman and someone who is identified with the left, that's going to be a bold decision. And it could be a decision that could be exploited by the Republicans. They won't do it in a very open way, but quietly they could very well try to exploit that to take advantage of the sort of, let's, for want of a better term, the quietly racist vote in certain parts of the United States. So this is a problem that Joe Biden has. And if I had to give him advice, I'd tell him to nominate a woman from a member of Congress from Florida. Her name is Val Demings. She's an African American, but she's also a former police chief. Yeah. So it would be hard for the left wing it would be hard for the right wing in the Republican Party to oppose such a nomination. So he has to be extraordinarily careful in that decision.
Jim, if I could say, in 2 weeks, I'm going to be hosting an event with Val Demings, raising money for another Democrat in Congress. All people have to do to get a look at Val Demings is come and contribute to my Democratic candidate, and you'll get a firsthand look at Val Demings. That's my infomercial.
Great. Well, hey, gentlemen, I know that our time's up. I just wanted to sincerely let you folks know that I thought it was an outstanding session today. I personally learned a lot, and the people who I have here in this room also learned a lot. We're very, very grateful for your contributions today. I also want to let you know I'm a big fan of Tom Hubbard, so I'm glad he's on this call. Right. And keep up the great work, Tammy. We hope that we can host you officially in Korea, and we want to continue with this partnership. So thank you so much. Regardless of who wins, I learned a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.